Okay, now we're going to spend some time getting to know the GUI or graphical user interface of these new Denon receivers. As you can see here, I'm watching a standard HDMI video feed. This is my Roku box streaming MLB TV right now. I'm going to pause the video right now just so that you don't get annoyed by the strobing graphics from the plasma refresh rate artifacts. So, watching a video feed right now over HDMI, press the setup button on my Denon remote, and the GUI pops up and it overlays on top of the video feed. This is one of the cooler new features of these Denon receivers. The graphics, all of them, overlay on top of any video signal that you input into the receiver, as long as you're outputting to your TV over an HDMI cable. These graphics will not show up over a component feed or a composite feed. They're only going to show up over the HDMI feed, so they're really pushing you to an all HDMI universe now, and these graphics, again, will only show up over the HDMI cable to your TV. If your TV doesn't have HDMI inputs, you probably don't want one of these new receivers. You probably want to look into an older model because these new receivers are really designed for an all HDMI universe. So, backing out of the setup menu for a second, in addition to the setup menu graphics, it'll overlay volume display graphics. You can see there's the volume bar right there. And in addition to that, new to these 13 models, there's an info button. When I push the info button, it pops up a little display. It shows you what the source is. It's my Roku. The surround mode is Dolby Pro Logic 2 Music, and the volume is shown on the bottom. So after that edit, we've now switched to a blank screen so we can walk through the menu without you being distracted by the graphics in the background. So for those of you who are familiar with older Denon receivers, you can see that the menu structure has changed pretty significantly from how it used to look. In my opinion, this is actually an improvement. The category is a little bit more logical. You don't have to go diving around to as many menus to find similar settings. So just as an example, I'm going to skip ahead to the video menu. And you can see there's a variety of options here that all relate to the picture that's being output to the TV. The picture adjust menu is where you can adjust the brightness and contrast and make other individual tweaks to that input. HDMI setups where you turn on your HDMI control, the standby pass-through, lip sync settings, etc. Output settings are where you control video processing. That allows you to turn on your video conversion, which allows it to overlay graphics and convert analog video to digital video, and also the scaler for changing resolution if you want to engage the video processing. Volume display, info display, and audio display control the types of information you see on the screen, and then the TV format where you can switch from NTSC to PAL TVs. So now previously, there used to be a video adjust menu where you could do this picture adjust stuff, but the HDMI setup was buried in manual setup in an HDMI menu. The resolution settings were under each input setup, and then these infographics displays like volume display, info, etc. were buried in the manual setup menu in the GUI options. So you would have had to go to 4 different menus if you wanted to change all of these settings. So now we're going to back out, and then I'm going to walk you through the GUI here, show you all the different areas in the GUI and what you can or cannot do. Now, again, this is a Denon receiver, so this isn't the perfect GUI interface. This isn't the type of thing you get from Apple or Google, who have a real strong sensibility about user interface design, but it's very functional, it's logical, and it gets the job done. So, audio menu, as you'd expect, this is where you control anything having to do with the audio signal. This is the menu you're going to be diving into most of the time if you're making on-the-fly adjustments or just trying to tweak the sound. Surround parameter, this menu allows you to make adjustments specific to that surround mode, and whatever you get in this menu is going to be dependent upon what surround mode you're in. So for example, right now I'm still on Pro Logic 2 Music mode, and so these are the options I get here. If I was in Dolby Digital, I'd have a different set of options. If I was getting a DTS master audio signal, I'd get a different set of options. So these options are unique to whatever sound field you're in. So if you're looking in the menu or the manual and you're like, why is this thing not here? It says it's supposed to be here in the manual. That's because you're not in a surround mode that actually utilizes the parameter you're looking at. So if you're curious about it and you're feeling masochistic and you really want to start diving into the Denonese and really learning about these Denon receivers, there's a big chart in the back of your manual, and it shows what parameters are available in every single surround mode. It's a giant matrix grid. So if you're patient and you're willing to work through this matrix, you can figure out what parameters are supposed to be there depending on the surround mode you're in. So the tone control, as you can see right there, is grayed out. Tone would allow you to adjust bass and treble, but as you can see, it skips right over it. It's grayed out. The reason it's grayed out, just floating down to the Odyssey menu, because as you can see, I'm using Odyssey Dynamic EQ. Odyssey Dynamic EQ essentially modulates the tone for you. It keeps track of the tonal balance, it adjusts the bass, it adjusts the highs, it tries to keep everything with the same tonal balance you'd get as if you were listening at reference level where the mixer was putting the audio track when he was recording it. Now most of us at home listen at a much lower level, so what dynamic EQ does is it keeps things in balance, and because it's doing it automatically for you, the tone controls are blocked out, so you can't manually adjust the bass and treble. If you do want to adjust bass and treble manually, all you have to do is turn dynamic EQ off and you're free to adjust the tone manually. Dialogue level control is basically a shortcut to the center channel volume. They call it dialogue level, but it really is just the center channel volume control. So you'll notice here, if you run Odyssey and it sets your center channel to -3 like it did mine, the dialogue setting magically is also at -3. That's because it just is the center channel volume control. Now, we talked before about how Denon has stripped down the remote and just kind of simplified things, only put the essential buttons on there. One of the consequences of this is that you no longer have a channel level button on your remote. There used to be a button that you could push and it would pull up all of your speaker volumes on the screen, and you could make adjustments to the speaker volume. They no longer have that, so the only way to make channel level adjustments is by going into the speaker setup menu and running those loud test zones. So what they did instead, if you think about it, two things most people are going to want to adjust are the dialogue level, because they can't hear the dialogue when they're trying to watch a movie, and the subwoofer level because they want to make the bass higher or they want to make the bass lower. So what Denon has done is they've given you two direct shortcuts to these modes. So you can adjust the subwoofer level in the sub-level menu, and you can adjust the center channel volume in the dialogue menu. And realistically, those are the only two tweaks that most people are going to make. And just for your information, both of these things are memorized by surround mode. So if you make some tweaks to Dolby Digital, it's not going to carry over to, for example, multi-channel stereo. So going through these last few options, the restore menu is where you can set the restore modes on and off, and there's actually 3 different modes. These are for restoring compressed music like MP3s or screen audio. The audio delay menu allows you to set an adjustment where you can correct lip sync errors when the audio and the video signals are not in complete alignment. In the volume menu, there's a few options related to volume. Scale, you can change it from a relative scale, which runs from basically -80 to +18 with 0 set at reference, or you can change it to an absolute scale that runs from 0 to 98 if you really feel better seeing everything in a range of all positive numbers as opposed to negative numbers. Same volume, just different scale. The volume limiter allows you to set a maximum volume so your kids can't run in the room and turn the knob up and jack up the volume and blow out your speakers. I have mine set to 0, so I know that it's never going to get to the positive range, and the reference level is the maximum it can go. Power on level lets you set what volume the receiver is when it turns on, and then the mute level allows you to set how you want the receiver to mute, whether you want it to be a full mute where everything goes silent, you want it to be attenuated by 40 decibels, or you can have it to be attenuated by just 20 decibels. Now, why would you want to have your mute button be anything but a full mute? There's a little trick that a lot of people aren't aware of. When the mute is set to full mute and you hit the mute button, you're going to hear a really loud click from the receiver. This is a relay internally in the receiver that's actually switching and makes a very loud audible click. And a lot of people get annoyed when they have to mute the volume and they hear this big click. If you set the mute to -40, now attenuating the volume by 40 decibels is a lot. That's 10 to the 4th less power than you would normally get. So it's literally 10,000 times less power than what it would be if the mute was off. It pretty much makes things silent, or effectively so silent that you can't really hear it anyway. The nice thing is attenuating the signal digitally does not cause a click because there's no relay being thrown. It's just a digital thing going on in the processor. So I always set my mute level to -40 because I hate the click, and that way when I mute it, there's no click. It just makes the signal essentially inaudible by attenuating it by 40 decibels. So the last thing we're going to look at in the audio menu at the very bottom is the Odyssey settings. This allows you to turn multi-Q, which is the room correction, on and off, dynamic EQ, which is the tonal balance correction, on and off, and also dynamic volume, which controls swings and volume, so you don't have to jump for the remote when things in the movie get loud and you're afraid the wife's going to yell at you because you woke the baby up. You can use dynamic volume, it'll control the swings for you. So last few menus we're going to look at. The input menu is where you can assign your inputs, you can rename your inputs, you can hide inputs you're not using, so you don't have to, when you turn the knob or cycle through your inputs, you're not going to see inputs that are not even in use. Source level lets you balance the inputs, and then there's a couple of specific settings. Input select allows you to designate whether you're going to use an HDMI audio feed or a digital audio feed or an analog audio feed for that particular source. And video source, in theory, allows you to mix a different video feed with the audio feed from that input, but in reality it's a very limited practical use because you can't use an HDMI input with this. It's kind of a legacy from older receivers. This is the way you were able to mix different audio and video feeds, but it really should disappear at this point because you can't use HDMI, and like we talked about before, pretty much everything you're doing is HDMI at this point. Speaker menus where you access Odyssey setup if you want to set things up automatically, or if you want to set things up manually, or if you want to make tweaks after running Odyssey. The manual setup menu lets you tweak your speaker settings. The network settings menu is where you make any configuration related to your network, pretty self-explanatory. The general menu is sort of your catch-all bucket. They dump everything else that doesn't fit into any of the menus in here. Language, zone settings, rename your zones. For example, I renamed my zone 2 to say backyard. You can change the quick select names. You can turn auto standby on or off. Now, auto standby is nice because it'll turn the receiver off automatically after a designated amount of time. So if you turn on AirPlay, you're streaming music to your receiver, and then you walk out the door and you take your iPhone with you, you don't have to worry about leaving the receiver on because it'll just turn itself off after 30 minutes or 60 minutes, depending on how you set it. Front display just allows you to dim the front panel. Information gives you a variety of information about input signal, video signal, etc. You can check your firmware version, and also you can update your firmware here or turn on or off the notifications, so when the receiver comes on it prompts you to update your firmware. If that's annoying you, you can turn that off here. And finally, there's a setup lock which will prevent your kids from running up and mashing the buttons on the receiver and screwing up your settings. That's pretty much it. The only other thing in the menu is the setup wizard. This is a setup assistant which walks you through all the connections. You would see this when you first plug in your receiver after you open it up and take it out of the box. I'm not going to run through this now because I've already set up Odyssey, but this will run you through your speaker connections, calibrating your speakers, setting up your inputs, and also setting up your network.